Hey everybody, welcome back to lesson number 11 for the Stylized Game Weapons class. In this lesson we will finish up the color map here in 3D Code by doing things such as adding the highlights right here in the concept, refining the edges, adding in some color variation, and so on. For the purposes of this demo, I will take a couple portions, mainly just this top stone piece right here, and I will bring it to a finished state. This will basically provide you with a general idea of the process that I use for finishing things up, and then I'll load up the file to show you how I kind of carry down that same technique onto other areas as well. So we will start off this main stone piece right here, and the first thing we're going to do is lay in these major highlights right here. So we're going to use basically the sculpt that we baked on here as the guide for this, and I'm going to choose an overlay layer, and for the color of this, I'm going to go ahead and check or choose the base color, and I'm going to do something that's lighter, definitely a lot lighter, and a little less saturated. Now in general for overlay colors, I tend to do something that's definitely a lot lighter and a little less saturated. Now if you're going to want this highlight color to really kind of pop out, that's maybe an instance where you might want to definitely make the saturation a little bit more. But in general, I kind of work in these angles where the midtones and darks are more saturated and the lights tend to be a little less saturated, definitely a lot lighter. The other thing is you want to think about color temperature. In general, kind of what we're doing here is having it so that all the warm colors, all the highlights are a little bit warmer and all the shadows are a little bit cooler. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit warmer as well. I'm starting to block this in. And now, as I am starting to do this highlight, one of the things I'm definitely going to start considering is line variation. So usually right at kind of corners, I tend to make the line variation quite a bit thicker. And now part of the reason why for this is that usually around corners, it's more likely that a corner is going to potentially have a little more wear to it, that maybe it receives some damage and is a little sort of maybe chipped away or a little bit softer. And if an edge has a little bit of wear to it, you know, when it's lit up, that highlight on that edge isn't going to be pristine or necessarily really sharp anymore. If it's worn away, it might get a little bit more thick, diffuse, or larger kind of thing, instead of it being really kind of sharp, really kind of tight. So, kind of just alternating. Maybe on this corner, I'll make this really thick, and then maybe with the eraser tool, I can kind of go in. Actually, for this stage, I want to make sure that my eraser is at 100%. So I'm going to kind of carve out this line. Maybe make it thin again, and really thick. Just kind of keep alternating that. Find opportunities to kind of change it up a little bit. Maybe it's really thin here, and it starts getting really thick again. Kind of think of it like how you're kind of pressing on the tablet or the Cintiq. You go thin, and then you kind of really press down. You go thin, not much pressure, then you really kind of press down. You kind of keep alternating that a little bit. The other thing is, for something like this, is you definitely want to zoom out. So when you zoom out, it's going to give you basically more ideas on how you can maybe potentially alter these lines to really give you more impact. Because right now, there's a lot of kind of thin, not too much drastic variation yet. So maybe I want to really make this quite a bit thicker right there. Maybe thinner right here, but right here it gets thick again. Then the other thing is that right along this edge right here, I'm looking at this from front on view. I'm noticing that these side edges are kind of getting lost. So the other thing I can do is that in general, I just make these side edges quite a bit thicker. This will again provide some good variation because in here it gets quite a bit thinner. So everywhere up here, you can go ahead and make that quite a bit thicker. So you kind of get the idea. On corners, I tend to definitely exaggerate it a little bit more. And then right after a corner, I'll try to let it taper in a little bit. And you're not put too much pressure on the tablet. And then thicker, thin, and thicker. Just kind of alternate like that. The other thing I'll do is that based on this concept, there's basically like these extra facets, or these extra kind of cracks. So I'll start to blot that in really quickly. So, you know, and this will also kind of allow me to demonstrate sort of like this lost line. So, you know, because we got this line appearing fairly thick in some areas, like right here, it's going to be a nice bit of contrast if we allow this line to basically just disappear. Like it gets so skinny that it basically disappears right there. It's going to give us some really nice contrast. that. Again, you just kind of want to smooth it out. You don't want it to be, you know, I want to make sure there's some variation and it's a smooth transition. You don't want it to be, in some areas it can be a little jagged like that, but you don't want it to be jagged like that everywhere. Do something kind of like that. Again, there's these other lines kind of elsewhere as well, so we kind of lock that in. But you get the general idea. I'm going to load up what this looks like when I have the highlights kind of blocked in, top stone highlights done. Just take 1 second to load up. But you can see fairly quickly that really all it is, I just started to alternate. I left it a little bit kind of jaggedy in areas, but in other areas I really tried to make it fairly precise or kind of more deliberate. But now with that blocked in, the next thing I tend to do is I tend to kind of blend these edges a little bit or have the edges kind of bleed out a little bit. So what I usually do is just with standard layers, I kind of go over those highlights again. I have the same color selected, and what I tend to do is I do this in a couple different layers to kind of build it up. So maybe the first layer, it's fairly thick. I want to make sure I got the same color selected. It's fairly thick. I want to make sure I'm at 100% as well, at least for this stage. So I'm going to allow the layer opacity to kind of affect this. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to change the layer opacity immediately. It's fairly light. Sorry, fairly transparent. It's not affected too much. And this first layer, this bleeding layer, again, this is going to be a really thick sort of bleed out. Then I'm going to do for the next one, it's not going to be quite as thick. And again, I'm also trying to definitely think about line variation as I'm doing this. Where I want this to be a little more exaggerated, where I want there to be a little bit more blending, like that as well. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to now take this and I'm going to bring this down a little bit. So that's a value that's basically in between these, like so. And I'll find some opportunities where it should maybe be a little bit thicker. This is going to kind of give a little bit of a very kind of graphic blending look. But then what we can do is we can then just basically use the eraser tool, but now we're going to use that something like a 35%. And I'm going to go to this original layer, and I'm going to start to figure out, okay, you know, maybe right here I want this to be a little more subtle. And you know, I won't have it be subtle everywhere. Some areas, there's basically like a non-existent edge. That's what I like to kind of call it. You know, the edge, you can barely see it. It's so blended or blurred that you can't see the edge. And then in some areas, it'll be really still sharp. Just kind of vary it out a little bit. Don't have it be a sharp edge everywhere. So something kind of like this. Kind of get the idea. I just kind of keep building that up more and more. And as I take these layers on and off, you can kind of see how that really kind of allows those highlights to transition a little bit better. The other thing you can do is if you find that, you know, this highlight is the same value everywhere, what you can do is you can take maybe one of these base colors right here. You can start to kind of brush over it a little bit in some areas. Like maybe those connecting lights, you don't want that to be as bright. So you choose the base color, kind of go over that a little bit. Like so, and then you change the layer opacity like that, just so that those transitions are a little less, you know, it's a little more dynamic. There's a little more of a variation in transition between that. So that's the general idea for that. Now the other thing that you can do, I don't always do this necessarily, but you can also bring this into Photoshop and use the smudge brush tool. So I'm just going to at least show you how to do that. So what I do is I'm going to go ahead and merge these layers. So I'm going to go to Layers, Merge Visible, Textures, Export, Diffuse Map. I'm going to call this Smudge. Save. I'm going to replace it. And I'm not going to fill in the empty parts of the texture like I kind of did the last one. I'm going to exit out of this. File, Open, Smudge. And I'm going to first duplicate layer so we have the original one as sort of like a backup or a reference. I'm going to take the smudge tool with sample all layers, and I can really just kind of, I can either really zoom in and really kind of focus in on some of these edge transitions like so, and really just have it just in certain areas make it really blended. Like you can see that that's like really blended. You can do a really good job with the smudge tool to get a really kind of smooth blended look. Or you can also zoom out quite a bit and just kind of like everywhere, just like really kind of blend this out quite a bit. And then you can kind of choose, like maybe you do this in Photoshop like so, and then you use something where like you change the opacity a little bit, so it's just like a rough kind of like blur effect kind of thing. So just to kind of show you what this looks like in 3D Coat, I'm going to go ahead and save this. So I'm going to merge this, save as, I'm going to call it Smudge 2. I'm going to go back to 3D Coat. I'm going to do another layer. I'm going to go to Textures, Import, Diffuse Map, Smudge 2. And you can see that that is quite a bit more blended or a little more blurry. So if you want something like that as well, you can definitely use the smudge tool. Or you can, if you just want to really kind of have more edge variation, you can do a combination of what I just showed you before and the smudge tool. And you can kind of slowly build it up and get some pretty nice effects that way. So that's one way that I deal with that. Usually after I figured out the edge variation, I got the blending that I like. So I got some really kind of more hard edges, and I've got some really more almost non-existent edges. Once I've kind of established that, I'll then go in and do some more color variation. So what I'll do maybe first is go to Overlay, and one of the first things I'm noticing is that the actual color between here and here is basically the same. The only difference is that it's a darker color. So what I might do is I'm going to choose a space color, and I'm going to definitely make this cooler because we're kind of going with that theme where everything that is in shadow, any sort of crack or crevice, we're going to make that cooler, and any sort of highlight, we're going to make that warmer. So we kind of start to block this in. And I'm going to change the opacity right away because I don't want it to be that drastic. Do something like this. Okay, really kind of quickly block that in. And what this is going to do is going to definitely add more contrast. So it's also going to make, from a distance, this read a lot better. Because we want these cracks to really kind of stand out. So if the colors are also more different, it's going to stand out more, and it's just going to be more apparent that this is like a major change, and this is like a crack. So zoom out, see that that is reading pretty nice. It's adding just a little more color to this piece in general. We can do another layer, and maybe maybe I'll even just do a color layer, and maybe I want to vary up the color in this within the crystal as well. Maybe I want to do something crazy like a desaturated pinkish purple. And this might be a little too intense, but I'll kind of just try it out in some areas, and with the eraser tool, just really kind of blend it in. So again, I've got the eraser tool at 35%, and I'm just taking these edges, this transition, and I'm trying to make it a little less severe. So I'm just kind of erasing it out so that it's almost like a gradient effect kind of thing, where at the origin it's a little less, at the origin it's still fairly opaque, but then as it kind of grades out, it's not quite as intense. And then maybe I'll take the entire layer opacity, bring that down a little bit, and you kind of see that that's just kind of adding a little bit more interest to this, a little more to it. Again, I can do a color layer. Maybe I want this to be just a little bit cooler, like so. Just choose a color. I'm going to make sure that this is actually saturated, like so. Now this is adding some nice kind of purples in here. Again, you can eraser tool it out a little bit. It's not quite as intense. You're seeing a lot of purples right here, but not much right here. So again, you want to kind of balance it out. So do something kind of like this. Change the opacity a little bit. It's just adding a little bit more and more variation. And now there's going to be areas where maybe you kind of went a little too far, you're not liking how it looks. You can just kind of easily just go in, choose one of those original colors like so, and either with a standard brush or whatever you like, you can kind of just go back in and reestablish the color that you would like it to be. Like so. Just change the opacity. So you can do things like that. Again, if you want to accentuate the whole warm and cool effect even more, what you can also do is choose this highlight color, make this quite a bit warmer. And what you can do is you can sort of just make it fairly large, but just in certain kind of key areas, make it appear just a little more warm. Like so. And again, I'm going to go ahead with the eraser tool, make the transitions not quite as severe. And I'm kind of rushing this for the interest of time. When you're doing this, you can definitely be a little more careful in your transitions and how you're kind of blending this all together. Basically, you kind of do something like that, change the opacities a little bit, and now some of those are reading as a little bit warmer. You're seeing you got some kind of odd reddish purples in there. And again, if you need to make it a little more consistent, you can kind of just go ahead and choose whatever your base color, wherever you want that to be. And then maybe what you do is you do a color layer, and you put that over the entire thing so that you kind of get rid of some of how intense of a difference, I guess you'd say, transition to RC, something like that, change the opacities, find however you like it. It's kind of a back and forth process like that. The other thing is you want to definitely make sure that a lot of the planes are reading, so what I'll maybe do is I'll go again to another overlay layer, I'll choose this top color, I want to make sure this maybe a little bit darker like so, and I'm just going to do this top plane right here because I want this to definitely kind of always appear maybe just a little bit darker, like so. So that's what I'm doing right here. Just don't want these two values to be too similar. Even when we're looking at this when it's not really necessarily lit, still want to make sure that everything's reading, even when it's not necessarily like lit. So we do something kind of like that. Again, we got something in the concept right here where in general it's a little cooler, a little darker. We can take that same color that we just chose, we can, with overlay layer, start to kind of block that in a little bit like so. Around here. And down here is not as intense, so I'm just going to use the eraser tool even more. And over here is a little more intense, but I'll just make sure that the transition is a little more accurate. So like that. So you get the general idea for that. The other thing I definitely want to go over before we close this out is how I do sort of a polished metal look. So I'm going to load up what this looks like with all of the highlights in there. And what I'm going to do really quickly is with a couple different overlay layers, I'm going to really quickly block in brush metal. We've basically already did this earlier with standard blend modes. It's basically the same thing as doing sort of what we did for the edge blending. It's the same thing, but we're going to do with overlay layers. So I'm going to make the first one fairly large, like so. Use the eraser tool, blend out those edges a little bit, so it's a smoother transition. I'm going to do one more overlay. Make this not quite as large, a little thinner. But again, I'm still going to kind of blend out those edges a little bit. Maybe I will go ahead and make this opacity, lower that quite a bit. Lower this one still even a little bit. I'll make one more layer, which is like really kind of skinny for that specular kind of highlight you get on like a brushed metal. Something kind of like this. I'm going a little fast here. You kind of get the idea, and I'll load up what this looks like in the final. You can see from a distance it's already starting to look like brushed metal. So I'm going to load up the final right now. So open, color final, and you can see now, it's going to load up in a second, that in the final I went ahead and took the same technique and I applied that everywhere. I did kind of this like brush look right here, brush metal right here. I added more of those edges. I went ahead and did sort of that graphic kind of edge blending all around here. And you know what? There's a couple areas where maybe I can go ahead and make this less intense right here, so there's more variation. But I think you basically get the point. So now stay tuned for the next lesson where I'll go ahead and start making the speculum.